do you feel like we need to be rethinking the traditional understanding of journalistic objectivity? And how have you sort of been approaching that in your own work?
Yeah, well, definitely. We really do have to rethink it. Uh, I guess the traditional, like coming from with a legacy arm, because we're part of this huge media conglomerate, right? And we're also part of this big one of the largest, if not the largest, print media venture. And so we're coming also from that tradition. um, and I think it's also true for most of the newsrooms today, say for a few such as Verifiles or Rappler that could actually set where they have begun, the kind of principles that they will have, or the kind of reporting. So they have the not just free hand, but were able to start that way. For us, we're also coming from that traditional training, even not just in our newsrooms and in the culture, but also how we were trained back in school. Uh, of course, whenever objectivity was discussed, we would be taught that's not really something that is realistic. It's difficult to be objective when you are approaching a topic, because you have to have some sort of a bias for something, and a bias for principles, bias for human rights. And but how this has been interpreted, I'm very lucky. I'm coming from a very good journalistic training background, but it's also not true. And I've also gone around a few parts of the country and talked to also yeah, educators there, and they're having difficulty grasping this and how to translate it to how the concept of objectivity in teaching their own students in communication. How would they be able to apply it in producing news? But I think it also has to start from our current practice now, that we have to identify as newsrooms, as individual journalists, what do we stand for, and who do we report for, because that was never objective. The truth is never objective after all.
Just to jump on Camille's point, it may be a cliche, but every time I write a story, I always ask myself, for whom am I writing for? So that's just what guides me in covering and writing every story ever since I started with journalism. But one of the first things that our journalism professors told us is that objectivity is a myth. And I do agree, because the media as an institution serves its purpose by selecting topics to cover, distributing concerns, framing issues, filtering information, or what we call agenda setting, focusing their analysis through emphasis, tone, and whole range of other techniques. So it's really entire system of filtering and gatekeeping. So clearly, objectivity won't really survive that kind of system. So for me, we just have to continuously ask questions whenever we're writing, even the smallest stories that we encounter. Whose opinions are we trying to get? Are we only depending on government sources, which is of course easier to do? Are we putting in as diverse voices as possible in our stories? So part of rethinking and understanding journalistic objectivity is to constantly updating or constantly improving our practice on the ground as individual journalists. And that, of course, translates to how the entire newsroom changes or innovates as well. But as long as at the core, as an individual journalist, you know what you're doing, you know who you're writing for, I think that alone is an important tool in maintaining the credibility of the media, especially traditional media.
I think we also have to break away from the usual mindset of he said, she said, or false equivalence of, to show that you're fair. You allot supposedly equal time to different sides, but that doesn't work. And an age where, of course, the state has vast resources to monopolize the discussion, to issue press releases, to actually dictate what goes on in the news, then you have to break that. You cannot just rely on what the government says. You have to check if it's true. You have to check what's the basis or what could be the motivation for this particular statement. And I guess you cannot just give them equal time. You have to go beyond that. You have to find out what is the truth here. Is it really raining outside, or is it just really a myth? I mean, you have to look at what really is happening, and you cannot just rely on what one person is saying. And this is very, very important at the time where the discussion on social media is very much dictated by what government officials are also saying. I mean, we have seen instances when the comments on social media are actually echoing the official stand, or it's the other way around. The official statements are actually echoing what social media is saying. So you now have to ask, is this really the official statement, or is this called from whatever everyone is saying on social media? So you have to break that mold. It cannot just be he said, she said.
I do agree with what was said so far. I want to stress this. Objectivity, that notion of objectivity and or an interpretation of that objectivity has actually been weaponized, if you ask me, against journalists. It's always repeated. I've seen this in many of these social media posts that we have been examining as part of our research on misinformation. And what has been what the way it is being interpreted is like by being impartial, so as Mike said, by allotting equal space for what certain parties say versus the others. You are being objective, but actually the notion of objectivity, and there's been quite a lot of discussion about this also in the US elections, is that you apply rigor to your coverage. You don't just, report what has been said, but you actually double check things. Then you point out when things are wrong. So there's a method to that process. Remember, journalism is that discipline of verification. That's at the heart of the at the heart of it, and being a discipline of verification, you cannot be impartial. You are actually partial for facts, partial for truth. So if somebody lies, it's wrong to say you're being objective by not calling out a lie, right? It's actually wrong and not being true to your calling as a journalist.